If you are studying law, one of the most important concepts that you're going to need to understand is the idea of legal precedent. But what exactly does it mean, and why is it so crucial in law, and how does it work in real life? Now, in this video, we're going to break down the basics of legal precedent so that you can have a solid grasp of what it means. We're going to use practical examples to help you. And so hopefully by the end, you'll have a good sense of how judges can use legal precedent to make decisions and why it's a real cornerstone of our legal system. So let's start by just describing what legal precedent means. Legal precedent basically is about a decision that is made by a court in a previous case, in a previous law case, and that decision serves as a guide for how similar cases can be decided in the future. And it's part of common law, which is used in countries like the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia. And so the idea is that you've got a previous decision that is made by a court, and that then serves as an example, a guide for how future decisions should be made in similar kinds of cases. Now, there are two types of legal precedent, at least two main types of legal precedent. And the first of those is binding precedent. And that's where judges have to follow that precedent. And the second is persuasive precedent. And that's where judges can consider a previous case as a precedent, but they're not required to follow it. So let's break down those two kinds of legal precedent with some practical examples. And let's start with binding precedent. Binding precedent, so where judges have to use the decision of a previous case in another case that's similar. Now, one of the most famous examples in legal history of binding precedent is the Donoghue versus Stevenson case. This was in 1932, and it was a case that led to the establishment of the modern negligence law. Let's describe the case. Basically, what happened was Mrs. Donoghue visits a cafe in Scotland with a friend, and that friend buys her a ginger beer. And unbeknown to Mrs. Donoghue, there is a decomposed snail in the ginger beer bottle. Pretty gross, I know. Mrs. Donoghue becomes ill, and as a result, she decides to sue the manufacturer of the ginger beer for negligence. The problem, though, was that she hadn't bought the ginger beer herself directly from the manufacturer. And so there was no direct contract between her and the manufacturer. And so what happened was the House of Lords, which at the time was the highest court in the UK, decided and ruled that a manufacturer owed a duty of care to the end consumer. However many rungs down the ladder that end consumer was. And so this decision actually introduced the neighbour principle, which is the idea that you have a responsibility to take reasonable care to avoid harming other people who could be affected by your actions. And the thing is that this became a binding precedent, which means that lower courts in the UK have got to follow that ruling when it comes to future negligence cases with similar kind of circumstances. Now, just to mention quickly, today the Supreme Court is the highest court in the UK, and any decisions that are taken by the Supreme Court are then binding on all lower courts across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So that's binding precedent. That's where a decision has been made by a higher court previously, and lower courts are bound by that decision when they have similar cases. The second kind of precedent, as we mentioned, is persuasive precedent. Now, a great example of this is in the R versus Bentham case from 2005. Now, in this particular case, it's quite an amusing one. The House of Lords, which at the time was still the highest court in the UK, they had to decide whether pretending to have a firearm, to have a gun, by placing your hand inside your jacket counted as possession of an imitation firearm under UK law. Now, the defendant basically, let me explain what happened. The defendant had robbed someone, and in order to be successful, had actually claimed that he had a gun during that robbery, but he didn't. He was just putting his hand underneath his jacket and making it look like a gun. Now, in order to make a decision in this particular case, the House of Lords referred to a Canadian case that was actually quite similar, where someone had, again, used their fingers underneath their clothes to make it look like they had a gun. And the Canadian court ruled that a person cannot be considered armed if they simply use their own body parts. Basically, you pretend to have a gun by using your fingers. Legally, you're not considered as having a weapon. And the House of Lords thought that that reasoning was persuasive. They thought it was a good line of reasoning. And so they decided to apply that in this case. And they decided you cannot you cannot be considered to be in possession of an imitation firearm if you're using your fingers to simulate that firearm, because you can't possess your own body parts, was their reasoning. Now, it's quite an amusing and convoluted example, but it shows you that UK courts can look to decisions from other countries, other jurisdictions for guidance. But importantly, in this case, the decisions made in those other jurisdictions aren't actually binding. And it highlights how you can have this idea of persuasive precedent, where it's not a binding precedent, but nonetheless you use previous examples from other courts in other jurisdictions even to guide you as you are making those decisions. Now, another thing to say about precedent is that precedent isn't set in stone. It's actually something that can evolve over time. So once you have a precedent that's set, it doesn't mean that it will never ever change. And there's a number of ways that that can happen. For example, courts could overrule a precedent if a higher court decides that the previous ruling was actually wrong. Another way is that a judge can distinguish one case from another by showing that actually the case that they're dealing with isn't actually quite the same as a previous case. It's different enough to mean that you can't apply the precedent. And then finally, courts can actually reverse a decision based on appeal, which basically means that you take the decision to a higher court, a court of appeal, and that higher court can change the outcome of the case. Now, a good example of this idea of overruling a precedent could be seen in an employment law. Now, in the past, UK courts allowed employers to discriminate against workers for being members of a trade union. For example, they could decide to not give them as many pay rises as workers who weren't part of a trade union. However, there was a case not that long ago which was actually brought to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled that discriminating based on trade union membership was actually a violation of the right of freedom of association. And as a result, the UK law ended up being amended to make it illegal to discriminate against workers for belonging to a trade union. And that shows that legal principles evolve and that legal precedent can be changed. So it's not necessarily set in stone. Now, as we kind of come to wrap up this video, let's just ask ourselves, why does legal precedent matter? Why is it so important? And the main reason that it's important is it makes sure that cases are consistent, that the law is consistently applied, because you look back to previous models of how the law was applied. So it means that one person further down the line is not going to get a different treatment to someone a few years ago, because legal precedent creates that pattern so that the law can be applied consistently. And in a general sense, that means that it's more fair as a system. So there we go. That's the basics of legal precedent. It's all about using past decisions to guide future ones, and it helps to keep the legal system consistent and hopefully more fair as a result. Well, I hope that this video has been helpful. I hope it's made the concept clear and has given you a better idea of what legal precedent is, and that it helps you if you are a law student in your studies. Now, if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments if there are any other legal concepts that you would like to learn about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.